Scott Dochterman of The Athletic joins us now, and we've talked at length over the last three shows about the 8-game versus 9-game SEC schedule. They've decided to stay at 8 for at least another year. I think that it's going to eventually go to 9, but it's kind of silly. And Scott, your column put a lot of numbers and facts to it as opposed to what the emotions are, probably fans outside the SEC. When you looked at it from the outside when they made this decision, what were your initial thoughts about them deciding not to play a 9th game, especially since they're the first conference to tell you how great they are every time they open their mouth?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's some really interesting facts. And when I started to look through the SEC, I wanted to analyze, how many Power 5 opponents they play per team, and then also the number of conference games. And when you look around the country at just about every conference, whether it's the Big 10, the Big 12, ACC, Pac-12 even, the majority of those teams play, either they play 9 league games and 1 power conference game and non-conference play, or it's 8 and 2 in the case of the ACC. Instead, the SEC plays 8 games plus 1 in many cases. So you have a Kentucky playing a Louisville or a Georgia playing Georgia Tech. And then there are those 3 games that kind of hang out there, and they're spaced throughout the season, especially right before rivalry week. So there is some advantages to the way they play. And I really think that if you're going to be a Power 5 conference, everybody should be on the same page as far as level of games against comparable competition. And I think in some cases, when I was looking at the SEC, I thought, yeah, you're playing 8 conference games and 4 non-conferences, and 3 of them are usually cupcakes. And so therefore you're having advantages. And I think the advantages, and I use this example about Ohio State in particular, in 2017 and 18, the Big Ten played 9 league games, and Ohio State went on the road in conference and played at Iowa one year and at Purdue another year. Games that if it would have been an 8-game season wouldn't have happened, and they lost those games. And like that case of the Iowa game, it came right after they beat Penn State in an epic game. Well, in the SEC, a lot of times those games come right after playing an epic game and right before another one. So there's not that trap component that I think would be a little bit more interesting, fair, and possibly have more intrigue than if they're playing Mercer, say, the 3rd week of November.
Scott, I'm sure your mentions were all very rational and well thought out and clear and concise, but I don't know, what was kind of the reaction you got? I mean, it's not often, Paul brought this up, where they're pretty bulletproof. Like, it seems like that conference usually makes the right decisions, and they're usually kind of ahead of the curve and all that. But he pointed out, like, this seems like the first time where it's not like some grave misstep because they can just correct it the following year. But does this kind of feel like the first time that they've done something and not everybody's just on board with it automatically?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I with my column, yeah, of course, people came at me pretty hard, and a lot of it is, hey, we're the best. And and everybody seems to own a piece of the SEC championship, even if it's 1 or 2 teams that win it on a consistent basis. And so I think that's kind of laughable to some extent. But yeah, I think there are rights for criticism, and it's deserved in this case, because if the Big 12 could go 9 games, if the Big 10 can go 9 games, then why can't the SEC? And it can't just be, it's tough on the road. Well, it's tough on the road everywhere. And I think the bowl games kind of shake that out. And there's always kind of this, we had players out in that bowl game, that's why that didn't matter. Well, let's keep it to the issue at hand. And I think what they're really missing out on is, I don't think anybody disagrees it's the best conference in the country, because it is. It has the best teams. They win the championships. But I think getting better games should be something that everybody wants to see. I mean, what's going to happen if they can't get this solved for 2025? Are you not going to really see A&M and Texas every year? Are you not going to see Alabama and Tennessee or some of these other great legendary rivalries over a century old, just because they can't figure out, they want to make sure that Kentucky can get to the Birmingham Bowl and be 6-6? I mean, I think that's kind of laughable. And then you look at the other factor, which is the college football playoff going to 12 teams. I mean, if a team in the SEC goes 10-2 instead of 11-1 because they're playing in the league, it maybe even bolsters their argument that, hey, we had to play an extra game in the best conference in the country. So I just don't understand why that there's this desire to keep their games at 8. I think it's just not, it just doesn't, jibe with everybody else. And I think it kind of devalues some of the arguments of being the best league top to bottom when you're not playing everybody in your conference on a consistent basis.
Well, shouldn't the new goal be to get to 12th, right, for your third or fourth best team in the league, is to make sure they're at least 12th so you can get in, and you don't want to leave the committee. If they can't figure something out, they will let you make the argument for them. And this seems like the first time they've done that too.
No question. Because if you're talking about the team number 12, now that you've got 6 at-larges that are going to be in the playoff, it very well could come down to the third Big Ten versus the fourth SEC, or fourth Big Ten against fourth SEC, to see who's going to get that last spot. And if you're at 9 conference games and you're playing another out-of-conference opponent that's really good, then the SEC might get the benefit of the doubt more often than not. If you're talking about 9-3 versus 10-2, or 10-2 versus 10-2, by playing that extra game. But if you start to look and say, yeah, well, okay, you played Louisville as your main non-conference game, but you only played 8 other opponents, and 4 of them didn't have winning records, and then you're playing, an FCS team and 2 group of 5 teams. It's really hard to make that argument, whereas I think the other leagues can now. So I think it bolsters it. I think it gets them more into the playoff, and let's face it, just makes better football games. I mean, there's so many times in those, the third weekend in November where you're going, okay, there's 2 SEC games and everybody else is playing an FCS opponent. Something's just not quite right here.
Scott, what about the argument that I'm sure you've heard a lot, and it's a legitimate reason? They need more money to play an extra game. They make a lot of money already, but hey, if we're going to play a 9th conference game, then we need to be paid for a 9th conference game by Mickey Mouse. Is that just a simple enough reason, you think, or is there obviously a bit more to it as you've laid out?
Oh, I think that's definitely if it's only a negotiation ploy, it's going to happen, because I mean, why wouldn't the ESPN want to make sure that they get the best games possible, because they stand to gain more too if you're getting Ole Miss Tennessee rather than Ole Miss Chattanooga. So I think that in its own right, I think that's something that will happen. And if that's the reason why they're postponing it, that's probably more understandable to me. But I do know that there's been some, just some serious disagreements. Some schools do want to go to 9, and others have said, no, we want to stay at 8. And a lot of that is just pertaining to bowl eligibility. And I just think that's safe and not really the SEC way, which is be the best and prove it. And so, but if money is a factor, that absolutely is a consideration. No question.
Scott, you've covered the Iowa Hawkeyes for a long time, and Gary Barta, their longtime AD, is retiring and stepping away. What do you think the future holds for that position at the department? What does it mean for Kirk Ferentz, who is ridiculously long tenured, and Brian Ferentz, his son, who is much maligned as the play caller for that team?
It is fascinating when you look at kind of the big holistic picture here at Iowa, just as to what's the next step. Right now, their deputy athletic director, Beth Getz, will step into the interim role. She's probably the odds-on favorite on getting the job, because she was an interim at Minnesota for a couple of years. She went to Ball State as the AD, and she's really qualified. So she's going to get the first crack, because they're not going to open it up until at least early 2024. So if she does a good job, she could just get the role there. What it means for Kirk Ferentz, I think there's probably a chance that they might be on the same page with the athletic director and the football program, rather than what's kind of experienced but specifically the last year or so. That they used to have a close working relationship, Gary Barta and Kirk Ferentz, who were the longest tenured duo in college football. But in recent years, that has been they've been at opposite sides on a lot of issues. And Kirk, had a kind of a frosty message for Gary when he retired. So, and they've been on the opposite end on NIL and some other topics. And of course, Brian Ferentz, the new guidelines that were put into his contract, 25 points a game on average over 7 wins, which won't be a problem for them. So that's going to be really interesting to see how close they come to that threshold. They're 51-2 since 2015 when they scored 25 points, so that's why the number was put in there. So I think, what happens if they get 26 points a game? Nothing. It'll stick around. But if it's 24.5 and they still win the West, that's where things are going to get really interesting.
Scott, thank you so much for hopping on the show. Really enjoyed your work on the NFL draft as well. Really liking reading that. And I know you're doing stuff previewing even next year, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done the group of 5, the top 10 prospects. I did that a couple days ago. And that's actually really hard now, by the way. It used to be kind of easy, but now with all the transfers and, going up to the Power 5 level, trying to figure out 10 guys who actually stayed at the group of 5 is very difficult, but that in the Big Ten and yeah, so I'm kind of spread out all over the place, but I enjoy it because I enjoy covering football.
A man of many talents, Scott Dochterman of The Athletic. Scott, thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
That is Scott Dochterman again. The Athletic, great subscription, always offering deals. You should do it. If you've not, it's fantastic. They've got really good